Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Before we get started, I would just really like to extend a very, very special thanks to our hosts here at Soho House, Toronto, for allowing us to use this magnificent space. I know some of the folks in our audience are Soho House members, so thank you so much for joining us. Others are connected to the power plant directly, staff, board members, and just fans and followers of the power plant. So we really appreciate that. One quick reminder from Soho House Toronto, please, no photography during this period. We do have a photographer and a videographer, so you will see photos of this talk, but please do not take any of your own. Look at that, jumping ahead. This project with our artist featured tonight, Amalia Pica, would not be possible without the steadfast commitment of the Kerner Foundation. So, of course, we extend very special thanks for that. We're also very thankful for support from Lonty Ebers, the Cure Foundation, and Catherine Barbero and Yvonne Fleck. The power plant also receives funds from federal, provincial, and city governments and agencies, other agencies. And so at this stage, I will pass things off to my colleague, Carolyn Kuschling, our curator of exhibitions.
Welcome, Amalia. Amalia arrived today, and it's not her first time in Toronto, but it's her first time at the power plant. And this is really like a wish come true for me. I have been following Amalia's work for quite a while. And in my very first conversation with Gaetan Werner, I mentioned her work and my deep interest in working with her. And luckily, Gaetan shares the same fascination for your work. And we are very happy that you are here with us tonight. This afternoon, we moved Amalia Pica's ears, 3 monumental cardboard sculptures, into the exhibition space at the power plant. This is an extremely uplifting moment, I think, for everyone, for curators, for artists, for everyone. As something that you only imagined or spoke about in theory suddenly takes form and enters into an environment that we prepared for it. More so as the work is a new commission that Amalia produced for her exhibition Ears to Speak Of. The cardboard structures are reimaginations of sound mirrors that were built after World War I on the coast of England in Dench, Kent. Designed to predict aerial attacks, they were quickly outmoded due to the evolution of aircraft and radar technologies. This new commission continues Amalia's engagement with outdated technologies and the failures of communication in a time where countries are closing down communication channels and shutting their borders. Again, Amalia, I'm grateful that you are here with us tonight and that you accepted our invitation to share insights into your artistic approach, talking about your recent work and also how it relates to this new commission. So please join me in welcoming Amalia.
I'm going to try to put this here. Hi. I feel like I should sing, but I'm not going to, don't worry. Thank you for having me. It's an absolute honor for me to be here. I'm also, as Caroline said, super excited today because today is the beginning of the setup of the exhibition that we are opening next week. And it's hard sometimes to explain what it feels like as an artist to be offered such an opportunity and to have a wonderful team like the team at the power plant making your ideas possible, your dreams possible. So I just can't say how thankful I am. I decided that I was going to go way back with my work because I thought it'd be nice to give you a bit of a context of where I come from. I'm originally from Argentina, from a small town in the north of Patagonia. And then I moved to Buenos Aires to study art school. So this is what you see here is a talking point for me for the first work that I did or that I still am sort of proud of. When you go to art school, you do a lot of things that maybe you later come to regret. And this one happened after art school. What you see on the left is the house where independence from the Spanish colony was claimed in 1816. And what you see on the right is an image from a school book. For some reason, well, the house was a private house, so independence was declared in a province in the north of Argentina called Tucumán. What happened was the liberator of Argentina needed to cross the mountains to go and fight independence for Chile because there was a sort of a Pan-American or Pan-South American project for independence. And they needed to formally declare this. So this was a private house, and by the time it became public monument, it was already very in a state of decay, and they preserved the room where independence had been declared and tore down the facade and made something completely different. And then a movement in parliament came and they rebuilt it as it used to be, following a daguerreotype and architectural excavations. And so it has a whole history. And I was interested in sort of trying to investigate or poke into the question of whether our vision is educated, let's say. So our imagination is conditioned, let's say. Images are not these sort of intuitive things, but things that we learn. And in Argentina, school played a really important role in trying to homogenize an imaginary for immigrants. So primary school had a big role with that. But basically what I wanted to do was try to see which images I had in common with other people and see if I could speak to them through those images that we all recognized. But of course, when I left Argentina, I realized that I was actually making work about Argentinian history. But that wasn't my interest. So this is me. What happened was I also rang a school bell. That's why I'm wearing this pinafore, which is the school uniform from Argentina. And this is another example of me transforming the horse of this monument into a white horse, which there's a saying for school kids, which is which color is the white horse of San Martin in the case of Argentina, or in other places Napoleon. And so what I did is I sort of painted the horse with chalk, so it had no glutinous component, and so it was washed away with the first rain. But it was, again, this sort of school intent of portraying history in this really heroic manner, so that we think of the actors of history as heroes or magical beings rather than just people. And sort of trying to see how this sort of was something that couldn't sustain itself. But as I said, I was trying to look for images that we all recognize. So if you say to someone in Argentina, if you talk about La Casita de Tucumán, which is this monument, everybody thinks it's yellow. And if you say what color is the white horse of San Martin, everybody knows what you're talking about. But then I won this scholarship to go to the Rijksacademy in Holland, and I realized that I didn't want to stand here and tell everybody that everybody in Argentina thinks that the House of Independence is yellow, because I didn't want to be like an Argentinian artist as in representing that, but I also mostly didn't want my work to exist as with this sort of explanation, because I was trying to look for things that I would have in common with people, and suddenly I was tapping into things that made me really different, and I only realized that when I left Argentina. So then what I decided to do was I tried to focus on the sort of on more universal images, of trying to sort of think, okay, what I was looking for was this idea or encyclopedical knowledge of the images that we have in our mind and the gap that there is with the experience of those spaces or images, which this is a sort of a simple example of like this house that we all learn to draw and then random house. But when I went to Holland for the first year, I was paralyzed because I was like, what am I going to do now that I, I was working on this line of work, and then now I have to tell everybody about Argentina. And then, so I decided that I was going to work through all these questions. So I reached some partial answers and some partial solutions, but I decided I didn't want to stop making work just because I didn't know how to deal with this. So the first year there was these open studios after this 1 year at the Rijksacademie in Amsterdam. And so I opened my studio. This was the first time that I had a studio. And I opened my studio, but only in 45 degrees. So the door was fixed in 45 degrees. And as you see, I didn't really know what to do with my studio because it was the first time that I had a studio. So it looks a bit like a living room, but that was my studio. And so what I did is I decided to, instead of working with images that I thought other people also knew, and the gap between that and reality, I decided that I was going to replace that first encyclopedical knowledge for things that I knew about Holland before I went there. And so I took this orange color, which is the color that Dutch people use to celebrate their royal house. That is, their surname is Oranje, which is orange, but also for football, and it's a national color, even though it's not part of the flag. And so I painted everything that was in my studio in the color orange, but I actually only painted the things that were in the line of sight from outside. And once you would walk into the studio, the things that you couldn't see, or the side of things that you couldn't see, weren't painted. And it was almost like sort of a metaphor for this thing of where you go to a place and you think you know things about that place, and you have this democratic identity that covers everything and describes everything. And then you go in and things are of its own kind. And they're way more complex than these sort of symbols that we sort of latch on to try to grasp where we're going. But of course I knew that this solution was a really partial solution, because then I was like, well, if I go to Japan, I'm going to have to make work about sushi, in a sense that you can't operate in a profound way or in a deep sense when you are trying to make a comment about a place that you don't really know, which might be interesting. There's something interesting about operating on that sort of surface level, but I felt that I didn't want my practice to be this. But as I said, I knew all these problems, but I just wanted to go through them by making work. This was another Dutch-based performance that I did, in which I organized people who were living in Holland as immigrants and people who were from Holland and owned Dutch wooden shoes to be on each other's shoes for half an hour and make as much noise as they could. So this was a performance that was also based on this previous idea. It ended up being sort of a party without music. And then the second year, I decided to more focus, to try to take advantage of problems of displacement or translation, or try to look for symbols that were universal. Maybe I'm going to show you. So there was this sailing festival in Amsterdam called Sail Amsterdam that they do every 5 years. And I talked to the captain of this really old boat, which is a museum boat. And I talked to them about putting a camera on the boat. So the boat was going to go to do a transatlantic journey. So this is, in a sense, two works at the same time, which was the first time that I tried that, and it's something that has become an important part of my practice, in which I, on the one hand, organized this happening where I wanted to give people white handkerchiefs without giving them any instructions, to see whether we actually do recognize that as a sort of a symbol of departure and of goodbye, and whether that was a universal thing. This was the same harbor where people migrated to America. So it had also that history. And And then I decided to turn this into a film in which I would. On the one hand, it was the behavioral experiment on what happens if you don't tell people who are going on about anything, but you just give them a white handkerchief. And then the other experiment was like, well, my suspicion is that the origin of this gesture that might be recognizable by a lot of people in different parts of the world is cinematographic. Like, I feel like I only have ever seen this in a movie. So that is why I filmed it in this really old film format. And so when you were in my studio, in the Open Studios, you would see this in 16 mil and think that maybe this was archival footage, but if you looked at it enough, maybe you realize that the boat is actually from a very different period than the film format, and that people are wearing jeans, and that doesn't make any sense. And so it was sort of trying to actually explore not only displacement, but also what makes an image nostalgic, and what do we have in common that makes us think of an image as a nostalgic image? And this was another work in which I sort of tried to take advantage of this sort of feeling of displacement, which is quite self-explanatory. I'm going to skip some of them so that I don't bore you to death. Then I started to try to tap more into this idea of the things that we have in common, and trying to like this sort of need that I had to try to see whether images could function as language, or they could function as words. So I started to become interested in the question on whether art is a form of communication. One of the things that I realized was that I grew up, I was born during the period of dictatorship in Argentina, and I grew up with, maybe my parents were quite idealistic, and maybe with this idealistic idea that as an artist you have a social responsibility to have a voice, to be the voice of your time, if not necessarily a political voice, which I think a lot of Latin American artists do feel that, and I think that is something that we grew up thinking, that this is the role that artists have. But if not necessarily political, at least to be of your time, sort of a voice that carries the weight of the contemporary, whether that's something or not. And so when I was in Europe, I realized that art for European people is folklore. Contemporary art is folklore. They invented it, they came up with it, it evolved from their own lifestyle and relationship to art. So, and I also realized that they had no problem with the idea of it just being totally subjective, that you didn't need to be a voice. And I started to realize that maybe this desire that I had as an artist to have a voice or to have something to say was a new form of the romantic, in the sense that political reality is so hard to grasp that it felt sort of like the new big sublime, like the new big thing that you couldn't put into words. So I did these images in Germany, in the Black Forest, as this sort of big romantic site, where that's me and I'm holding that megaphone, and I sort of turn them into billboard-size images of me sort of trying to express this impossibility to speak. And then I spent a long time sort of investigating ideas around sending a message, receiving a message. So this is a work that I first did, a group of sculptures that I first did in Japan, in a city in Nagoya, the year that the museum was in front of the television tower in Nagoya, and this was the year that all Japanese television was going to go digital. So none of the previous antennas that people used to build to receive signal were going to be of any use, because now the signal was going to be digital. So what I did is I recreated all these models of handmade antennas that people used to to receive television signal and made them into sculptures because they were no longer useful, so they just became these objects to be admired. Then I spent a long time building sort of impossible microphones and just exploring this sort of idea on whether I had something to say or I didn't have anything to say. And for a long time I was so concerned about whether there was something that I needed to say that I just realized that there was this really important element in the communicative process, which is the listener, but not just because it completes that structure, but because when we talk, we haven't actually pre-thought everything we want to say, but it is through speaking that we think. So in a sense, speaking to someone is thought being performed, and that there is something about that person who is listening who actually enables thought, and that we might not even think. So I just started to think a lot about the listener as sort of a figure that I wanted to honor with my work. But I wanted to honor the idea of a listener through making images and objects that were visual experiences rather than acoustic experiences. So this one is a performance where a person is asked to listen into this glass that is otherwise stuck to the wall. So the glass is always there, and then every now and then somebody comes in that is in the know and will just stand there and listen. And so it's usually installed on a wall where there might be interesting things to listen to, but members of the audience are not invited to listen. They're just invited to watch somebody listen. And it's called Eavesdropper. And then I sort of took that idea further, and I think one of the things that I often do is I make versions of things. I think that I'm really interested in the relationship between form and ideas, and what happens if you change the form of something. So what happens if you change the color, if you make it bigger, if you make it smaller, and how those thoughts when you're in the studio also have an influence of what you're thinking about. So they sort of really, it's like it's sort of feedback in which you have an idea and then you try it and then you think, oh, what if I make it bigger? That might mean that thing. And so it's like this sort of exercise in meaning making, which really is only taken further by formal experimentation. So this is a formal extension of the previous work, which is called Eavesdropping, which takes me to the one of the sculptures that is going to be part of our show opening on Thursday, in which again I continue to explore or to try to honor the figure of the listener. This sculpture is called In Praise of Listening, and I don't know if that's immediately apparent, but it's a sort of a hearing aid that is amplified in scale, but through that amplification and the change in material, of course, it renders it useless. So it is a sort of a monument to these devices that we invent so that we can listen to each other. And hopefully that can become a metaphor of another sort. And this is another one of those sculptures. These are, these are the unique, because this is someone's ear cast. Those are the unique numbers of the ones that I actually did replicate. And so what I am doing in the power plant show is taking that idea of making a monument to listening to a completely different level and to a completely different scale. So I'm rendering in cardboard these devices that were invented in the First World War, which Caroline was telling you about. And this is an example of them. They were developed by the British to try to predict airplane bombing. And they had some of them, these are the portable versions, in which hearing was amplified. And of course, I love how absurd they look, and also the knowledge that they didn't work. That there's something about the funk technology that it is so, there's something quite sad about it, but also something so sweet that we make these huge efforts to try to amplify, to try to speak, or to try to hear. And of course, they're just quite comic. But they did contribute to the development of radar technology. And then you have the stationary ones, which are still dotted around in the coast of England. And the work at the power plant is based on this group, which is called, well, colloquially known as the Years. It also has a history of artists looking at them. So it's there's a film by Tacitus and some other people that I met more recently that have been interested in these structures. And what I wanted to do was, again, to sort of build a monument to them, but render them completely visual and completely useless. Because if you go to visit these structures, they actually do amplify in sound, not as well as this microphone, but they sort of do gather it. And so what you will see at the power plant, without telling you exactly or without telling you more, is sort of a rendering of these objects useless, and to turn them into what they also are, which is this sort of monuments to a desire of a project of amplifying sound, but also the ruins of that desire, and they sort of become objects of beauty in a sense. And the other thing that we are doing with the installation is turning them into the space so that they don't longer try to amplify the incoming airplanes that you can hear from the power plant, but they are sort of almost like having a conversation with each other. So it becomes like this subjective, absurd experience of it. And they are kind of based on this previous one, which I try to create. I made this in wood first, and then that sort of worked. It amplified sound, so I turned it into cardboard. And again, this was turned into a performance by asking someone to come and sit there and listen. And one of the things that, of course, I didn't think of is that people queue behind the performer to try to have a go, but you can't really listen. It doesn't really work. So it also has a little bit of this perverse thing. One of the things that I like often to explore when I do more performative works, which are very subtle, maybe in terms of you actually being able to tell that it is a performance, is I'm interested in this sort of interdependence that we have with objects and how they can exist on their own, but also we can activate them, or they become different if there's a performer. So I like this idea of making a sculpture that needs an actor, but can also be on its own. So that's something that I've explored a lot. And I've also sort of, with this idea of listening, I've also did this replicas. They're on real scale, so they're just replicas of earplugs, they're called. And the work is called Palliative for Chronic Listeners. And it's when I was talking to people and saying, oh, I want to make work to honor the figure of the listener. People would say, well, it's funny because you can close your eyes, but you can never close your ears. But the truth is that in a metaphorical level, we do. We can totally close our ears and choose not to listen. And I feel that more and more, that's a luxury. That it is a luxurious and privileged position to be able to choose not to listen. Or even in real estate terms, silence is becoming something that people pay for. So I did this work also thinking about that other problematic. This is another experiment that I did in, experimental work. It's called Switchboard. And of course, again, it's like this idea that there's this functional machine in which you can use it to communicate maybe with your friends, but then when people, it looks like an invitation for the audience to come and speak into these cans. But of course, it's very difficult to know where your friend is listening into, because the wall is really large and your friend is on the other side. So there's all this negotiation that needs to be made in order to be on the same channel. And then all people often say is just like, hello, which is quite sort of a funny use of the technology after spending so much time. So there's something about sort of teasing people into inviting them to participate, but also complicating that experience somehow, as a sort of a metaphor for that. These are a group of sculptures that maybe show a little bit another type of interest that I have in language. They're called catachresis. Catachresis is a figure of speech that basically is a term that comes from one discipline and then is misapplied into another discipline, or to name a new phenomenon that doesn't have a name. So it technically is a metaphor, because you're taking something from one world and naming something else. But because they are so natural to us, we no longer perceive them as metaphors. So, for example, the leg of a chair or of a stool, they don't have legs like animals or like humans, but we don't have another name for them. We've adapted this idea that they have legs, and we no longer perceive that as a metaphor. So what I did is I took objects that are all named after these metaphors, like the tongue of the shoe, the head of the nail, or the teeth of the rake, the eye of the potato, the teeth of the comb, the elbow of a pipe, the neck of a bottle, the eye of a needle, and then I just used it as a repertoire to make sculptures, which are total, in which the only meeting point of these objects is language, actually, but they become physical things. And I think that if you don't read the title or don't know what a catachresis is, you might never know why these absurd assemblages have been made. But what I sort of like or discovered in the process of making them is that you also kind of, all these metaphors or catachresis are based on the human body or the animal body. And we do the same thing when we look. We project images of animals or our own bodies, and we look at this thing and we think it's like a little creature. So I think that there's something about the way that we look and or see, and the way that we speak, that is very similar. And this is another aspect of my practice which is very important, or that I've worked with a lot, which is I've worked a lot with elements that had to do with celebration. And it again goes back to the this question of what we have in common. I feel like often carnivals or street parties or just parties are these moments where we come together with people who we're not necessarily intimate with or who are not part of our immediate circle and share a good time. And that as a metaphor is amazing, that we can actually share a good time with strangers. And there's something about, I feel like I would like my work to be something that is also a celebration, or that tries to be analytical, but it's also somehow happy or positive, or not just only critical, or built as an argument in opposition of somebody else's argument, but something that sort of is positive. So you walk around as an artist and it's so hard, because sometimes you see things that are vital and that are real, and that, you know, the world is so interesting, and you think, how am I ever going to make a work that can coexist with that? And so this work, as simple as it is a sort of a parable of that. So what happened was, this paper was on the floor and I sprayed these flags that have this sort of connotation of celebration, and I sort of gathered that color and tried to make an image with it. So it's that sort of thing of like, I'm going to take that thing that is so vital and that it works, and I'm just going to try to make an image with it, which is something that a lot of the works have. And this is a performance that I did with those party flags, which is called Strangers. So this was at the Venice Biennial, so the work in the background is not mine. And these people had this job in which they had to hold a string of flags for several hours at a time. And they had sort of, again, like they were playing with this function of decorating the space as their job, but also they were linked to each other. But the string of bunting is 10 meters long, so they couldn't really establish a conversation. But they were sort of totally linked by this thing. This is another one that I made with confetti, in which I basically threw confetti and then spent some hours sticking it to the floor with sellotape to, again, try to make that moment linger or something. And this is a work in which I, after a long time of having moved away from making work about Argentina, I was invited to the Venice Biennial, and the curatorial invitation was quite open, but it was based on, the title of the exhibition was Illuminations, and the nations part of the title was highlighted. So there was something about light and something about nation. And so I decided to take my own way and to think of light as maybe enlightenment and knowledge and education, and to think about the nation state and that relation, which had been very interesting and productive for me. And this was, for me, a return, because I decided to go back to make work about Argentina. And this was a sort of a moment that it's, the Venice Biennial is, of course, a very international forum. This wasn't as part of the pavilion, it was in the main section in the Padiglione Centrale. And yet I decided to turn to Argentina again, because I felt like if I was going to talk about a nation and an educational experience, it needed to be my own. I couldn't just do it with no locus. And so I made this work. What happened was these lights were hooked onto two different motion sensors, so they weren't always on, and as people walked by, one or the other one would come on. And there was a text below the lights, and the text said, explained what a Venn diagram was, which I don't know if anybody remembers what a Venn diagram is, but there are these blobs in which you put things of one kind and things of another kind, and the area in which there's an intersection is what they have in common. And so it explains that a Venn diagram is a mathematical illustration, and it portrays relationships of inclusion and exclusion in mathematics. And this in Spanish is called group theory. So they're an illustration of group theory, which in English is called set theory. So on the one hand, it explained that, and then it just jumped to say that during the period of dictatorship in the 1970s, citizens were not allowed to gather, and they could be in Argentina, and they could be prosecuted under the law of under the umbrella of the national security law. So you didn't need to commit a crime. You just had to gather with people, and you could be taken away for questioning or taken away forever. And so at the same time, set theory and Venn diagrams were banned from primary school programs. So they were taken out of the curricula. Of course, there isn't an explicit relationship between these two things, but I thought that there was this sort of interesting thing, which you have this social phenomenon and then its mathematical expression, and that you would not only try to eradicate the social practice of gathering, but you would also eradicate its mathematical expression. And for me, this was like, the question behind this act was like, can we think, let's say, for example, about the atom without the atomic model? Can we think about an image that actually help us hold that thought? But of course, I didn't want to only leave this sort of sophisticated thinking to that banning or that act of repression, because it might have been something else. So I decided to make a work after this one which would celebrate the possibility that mathematics might have, or geometry might have, for social expression, or as an illustration of social phenomena. by celebrating the presence of the human body rather than the absence or the disappearance of the human body, which is what happened in Argentina. And to emancipate that thought that I had attained in the previous work from its historical anecdote. So this work is called A intersection B intersection C, and it is expressed in set theory written language, which is that one. So that thing in the middle means intersection. And it consisted in a room full of just perspex shapes, geometrical shapes. And then this is the Tamayo Museum in Mexico. And then a group of people that worked in the museum would come on the hour and would hold a shape each. So they would pick a shape each and hold it for 30 seconds. And they had the instruction to overlap these shapes, generating the mathematical operation of intersection. And they had to hold it for 30 minutes, and then they would put it down, and then they would leave the shape somewhere else and make another composition. And so they would make 10 compositions, and then they would go. And so what happened was the room was also constantly changing because these shapes were being put in other places. And then I sort of started on a sort of a string of events in which I documented this in black and white and then based some sculptures on them. And then those sculptures would rotate. So I just sort of went off on a tangent, trying to make memorials to these intersections that every time were unique. So these compositions that the performers were making were very simple, but they were always unique. So they were like a testament to this getting together, or this instinct of these people coming together. And so I sort of came back to the idea of sculpture as memorial of something really small, which was this sort of thing. So these sculptures are just basically ways of holding together these shapes and recreating them. I then made a film. I really went on a tangent, so I'm not going. Then this became a language. And this again, I thought to try to complement what you're going to see in the power plant next week by speaking of different ways in which I have thought about sculpture, public sculpture. In the case of what we're going to see in the power plant, sort of homages to things that turn into sculpture because they're no longer useful. And this was a sort of a play on my idea of a public sculpture. This was a plant which traveled on that suitcase that I made for it. It was made of stone, and it traveled to people's houses for 1 year in London. So people would host it, and they would send me pictures of what they did with the sculpture and where that sculpture ended up. And this is another sort of work that is more recent, and it's performative, and it deals with again, with this idea of form and its incidence in the political, and it's called Assemble. And it's not about sculpture, but it's somehow about the public, so that's why it's after the public sculpture one. And it's basically I invited people to come and bring chairs, and they knew what was going to happen, but they had never done it before. And then there was one leader performer, which was in the know, and what would happen is they would carry their chair in a file. They would walk in a single file, and then by the time the last person was about to sit down in this circle, as if they were about to gather and have an assembly, the first person, sorry, that image is not there, but the first person would get up and go and form a circle somewhere else. So there was this constant process of formation or debate of ideas. I'm going to skip some works here. I want to talk to you about this more recent project. This will be the last one that I'll show you, in which I was really lucky, and I was invited to go to Nigeria to visit this Primate research center, in which they have these little sticks that really are sticks that were used by chimpanzees as tools. So in the 1960s, great apes had not been yet observed in the wild. And there was this anthropologist who was trying to inquire about the habits of the great apes to try to understand something about the origins of man. And he sent 3 women that had no scientific education into the wild to observe great apes. One of them was Jane Goodall, who is still alive and campaigning for animal and social rights in Tanzania, where she worked extensively. One of them was Diane Fossey, which there was a film called Gorillas in the Mist based on her story. She was killed by what is thought to have been the local poachers. And then there was another another woman who went to study orangutans. But this is somehow about Jane Goodall, because when she went there, she first observed a chimpanzee take a twig and strip it of its leaf and chew the end of it and dip honey with it. So there was this adaptation of making it into a brush. And then she saw it again where the chimpanzees would strip the leaves of this twig and then just lick it and stick it down an ant hole and wait for the ants to crawl into it and stick to the stick through the saliva, and they would just take it out and eat them. And this was not only a use of a tool as an animal, but there was also an adaptation. So when she wrote back saying, this is what I've observed, this was a major discovery, and it created a whole revolution of the taxonomy, because up to that point, the Homo faber was thought to be the only animal that could, us, that we would go around modifying the world with our tools. And suddenly there was these other animals that could do this. And this was also the first instance in which we were aware of how closely related we are to chimpanzees, that we are more closely related to chimpanzees than chimpanzees are to gorillas. So they really are our next of kin, if you want. But also they realized that chimpanzees this behavior had not been observed in captivity. So chimpanzees only do this in the wild, and chimpanzees in Tanzania do it in a different way and eat different insects than chimpanzees in Nigeria. And so this was the first moment in which the idea of animal culture started to happen, and how animals actually teach each other things. They don't just instinctively know everything. So of course, this as an artist was an amazing invitation. But it's often when the material is so interesting, it's often very difficult to make work out of it. So I did a first iteration of this project in which I, for example, turned these tools into silver, as if it was silverware, as a way of sort of talking about how we try to look at them through our culture, as we try to understand their behavior as culture, and then these fictional devices as if they were created by chimpanzees for us, as if it was a children's game in which we had to guess where each one will go. But in a sense, these are based on graphics, which were the first scientific diagrams in which sociograms, which were usually used for looking at human societies, were used to analyze ape societies. And so I made this work after visiting Nigeria and working with this scientist, which I showed in Bogota. And I also, reading about this, I became really, really interested in all these experiments that were done in America in the 1960s, in which chimpanzees were taught to use sign language, and some of them learned up to like 200 or 300 words and taught it to the baby chimpanzees. And there were all these experiments about art and, about language and chimps. And somehow they were really interesting to me, but they were all done in captivity. So the first chapter, I wanted to honor my invitation to Nigeria, where there's this researcher that observes these beautiful animals in a really ethical way, and they observe them remotely, and they take care of them. And then I decided to save that other more complicated thing in which, chimpanzees that are really sentient and social animals and extremely smart are then kept into isolation cells, and they develop dementia, but they're at the same time used to prove all these ideas about language and communication. So I wanted to save that as a sort of a second attempt, which is what I'm going to do at IMA. And somehow in Australia, and IMA and the power plant shows, the two shows are supposed to somehow talk to one another. And what I want to do is try to have this chapter of my work, which is really specific, which was really born from some really interesting invitation, to try to come back to it with this idea of interspecies communication and whether it's possible to bridge that gap, and to the idea that we could maybe possibly listen to animals as well as only just impose that. So the challenge will be to, in the show in Australia, to try to link this to my interest, to my main interest in communication, which is what the show at the power plant is going to be about. So that's going to be a tricky one, but I'm excited about it. And before I finish, which is the only last bit, I thought I'll show you a little experiment I did in Nigeria. So one of the things that was that I thought was like, well, all this happened because somebody observed these chimpanzees eating ants. So I filmed this little colony of ants, and I wanted to use ants as an excuse to display human ingenuity, not just chimpanzee ingenuity, both through mathematics and also music, of course.
Thank you so much, Amalia. We have some time for audience questions, so if anybody would like to ask a question of Amalia, just raise your hand and I'll come to you with the microphone. And please speak directly into the microphone.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the shift between constructing the shift maybe back and forth between constructing the viewer as the object, as the subject of the work, and the listener, you know, and that play that seems to sort of go back and forth in the work.
Yeah, I think it's maybe a little bit a parallel of maybe I have sketched that idea, but a parallel of making art and speaking, in the sense that, so I'm of course interested. When I first thought of being an artist, I didn't want to stop thinking, but I didn't know that I didn't have to. So it was really hard for me. Like, you know, I was I grew up in a small town, and I thought, okay, I like drawing, but I also like reading and thinking, and I didn't want to give that up, you know. So of course, I found out that you can actually make art and continue to think, and it's a way of thinking. But I've been very interested in that question between what happens if, like, you have this idea that is a thought that has a narrative, and then you have this thing that you made, and you can't really speak it. You like speak around it. But so I was always very interested between this relationship, let's say, between thinking and making. And when I came to the realization that you don't actually speak a message, but that you actually speak the message as you like, that there isn't anything that you need to say, but it's as you're saying it that it becomes the thing that you wanted to say. I realized that there's a parallel with art making, that you start making something which you're not exactly sure what it's going to be, but because you know somebody's going to look at it and you're going to show it, you start making it, and then it starts taking shape. So that there's a parallel between the idea of saying something and the idea of making something, because there is that process of enunciation, which is only possible because somebody's going to see it and because somebody's going to listen to it. So I guess that's where the parallel between the listener and the viewer is located for me.
Hello.
Hello.
My question is, your work where you took the shapes, the transparent shapes, and you turned them into sculptures. They read a little bit to me like kind of formal, and they sort of remind me of like Mondrian or something. They kind of, if you didn't tell me the story, I would think that they're kind of abstract works that are totally formalist. And you sort of need to know that backstory about Argentina and like your performance and stuff like that to understand the work. And I'm curious, since like you're interested in communication, whether I guess how you feel about that. That like at first glance, if I just saw them in the gallery and I didn't read any text about it, I would have a really different opinion of them if I didn't know like your story.
Yeah. So first of all, of course, they are a total wink to geometry and maybe the concrete movements. I would have thought of more specifically like Latin American ones, but any that you would come up with. So I like that there's these two levels of the work in which you can experience it as generative geometry through the human body, maybe as simple as that, or that you get to read in a wall text all these things that I was telling you about. And I don't think those things cancel each other. That is why I'm an artist that is interested in talking and thinking, but I'm also interested in making things that are visually enticing, because I think that is very, very powerful. And whether you have one experience or the other, it is really your choice. What I refuse to do is, just because my work can't hold all the ideas that I have and all the things that I hope it carries, I refuse to still not have them or talk about them. So I don't care if the work can't hold it. It makes me sad sometimes, but I also celebrate the fact that it carries its own visuality and that you can get something else from it. But I just think that just because as an artist you can't make your work what you wanted to say, you shouldn't stop saying things. They're just two parallel things.
Hi.
Hi.
Your work very ingeniously points out and magnifies the failure of communication between human beings. And you come up with some pretty diabolical ways to point that out to the visitors in your exhibition. And so I wondered what your experience is of the visitor experience in your exhibition, how your public reacts to the frustrations they encounter interacting with your work.
That is something I don't really know. But I can say that I hope, first of all, even though the failure of communication is enacted, I see potential in that, because I don't believe that we actually can be so straightforward about the way in which we think about communication. Sometimes obsolete technologies or failed attempts have more to do with interpretation in a positive way. So it's opening up that space in which there isn't a clear message, so you are not meant to decipher anything. So I hope that that's a more positive experience for the viewer. But as to the sort of frustrating experience of the viewer, I think humor is really important, and humor is a tool. So I hope that people might access the work through humor. But that's just a hope.
Hello. I wanted to ask, being Argentina such a wonderful place for literature, but I see that your work is very, that you like math. So
I'm terrible at maths.
but I see more math, or maybe, I don't know, I saw some mathematical references, but what is your relationship with Argentinian literature?
I mean, on a personal level, I have a really intimate relationship to literature. It is true that it is unquestionably the most productive and of the art forms that have been developed in Argentina. There are amazing visual artists, but the writers that Argentina has produced are of an amazing level, and I have read them and continue to read them exhaustively. But I would say that maybe I'm not good at, I can't extend the narrative. I think that's why I'm interested in image. I can't tell a full story. So I sometimes recognize that sort of a lot of my ideas come while I'm reading. But I think it's because they open up a space in which I can sort of add something to what I'm reading, which hasn't been provided by the writer. So I guess I'm just an avid reader or a good reader, and that is enough for me, but it's also an integral part of how I think through reading. And I mostly read fiction. So not theory. I don't think that's a complete answer, but it is not a very straightforward relationship to literature. But it is something that has been extremely formative for me.
Okay, we have time for one more.
Thanks, Amalia, for your presentation. I have a quick question, because you repeated several times throughout the talk of this, let's say, translation from the acoustic to the visual that has been kind of a modus operandus for a lot of it. And I'm wondering, a lot of the tradition of sound art within the contemporary art field has been a critique of the primary aspect of the visuality of culture. And so I'm wondering how you wrestle with perhaps these political critiques or political, at least, milieu that you're working from and trying to access through very formal means, and the strong tradition of you turning acoustic or visual communication into the visual field, which has kind of dominated the art discourse, and how that's kind of an opposite strategy of a lot of people that are dealing with sound in the history of contemporary art. And if there's any contrast or conflicts that you've ever felt within that translation into a primary medium that's very collectible, that's very museum-orientated, versus the struggle that sound art has been trying to engage with a lot of the same ideas.
To be honest with you, I'm not in dialogue with sound art at all. It's not because it just has never come naturally to me to express myself through sound. It's not something that I do. I disagree in sort of pinpointing that because I'm object-oriented, or because I think the possibilities of the object or the visual are not exhausted, and that points towards the things that can be collected necessarily. I think that listening, as in music, and often terrible music, is way more mainstream than going to a gallery to see an object. So as much as I can empathize with the struggles of sound artists, my work isn't necessarily built in reference to that. And in fact, I come from a tradition of making with very humble means. And I believe that to make sound art, you also need to access quite high tech, so quite a sort of sophisticated technology that wasn't necessarily available to me through my education. So that I could sort of turn around that argument and say that, well, in order to produce sound work, you also need to speak a very sophisticated language, whereas I'm interested in the sort of immediacy of that. So I guess my advocation for form has to do with sort of trusting physical experience, not necessarily visuality. I think a lot of the work being sculpture is not necessarily about an image as such. It is an experience that it isn't audible. And maybe I was sort of more pointing towards the absurd. It's not necessarily a critique, or it doesn't necessarily speak to sound art. It is more about how absurd it is to sort of turn a device that it should be something that you use for listening to just be viewed. And I think that has to do with, again, sort of appreciating form, and how form becomes more formal when it's no longer useful. So maybe that's a sort of it's answers to several points. But I would say that I'm interested to hear your question, and I'm interested in the point that you make. It's just something that is not in my scope. It's not something that I grew up experiencing, actually.
Very good. Well, once again, please extend a sincere applause for Amalia Pica.